Another day, another round of live service failures, and today, we now have 2XKO and Highguard to add to the pile. 2XKO is a free-to-play fighting game released on January 20th, 2026 by Riot Games, the studio behind League of Legends and Valorant, and Highguard is a free-to-play PvP raid hero shooter released on January 26, 2026 by Wildlight Entertainment, with veteran developers from Apex Legends, Call of Duty, and even Titanfall. Both of these games are very new, and yet, after a few weeks, they're now doomed to die. That's because on February 10th, 2026, Riot laid off half of 2XKO's development team, letting go of around 80 employees. Then 2 days later, on February 12th, 2026, an employee revealed on LinkedIn that Wildlight has laid off most of its staff, which the studio later confirmed on Twitter. Both studios have said that development will continue with the remaining team, but let's be real here, development on both Highguard and 2XKO are now pretty much dead in the water. The development will be limping on for a while, but a full shutdown is now inevitable within the year. This move signals that both studios have lost confidence in their games. They might try to make it seem more positive than it is, but let's be honest with ourselves, they wouldn't do this if they thought the game could be a success. Any further development will probably work on sunsetting the game and adding what they can before the studios cut their losses and stop development entirely. This is because both games did not attract enough players to engage with the monetization due to being free to play. They're reliant on people spending money, but there's not enough players around to do so. Without enough people spending money, they can't justify continuing to invest in their game's development, which means the game gets shut down. And this fate seems inevitable for 2XKO and Highguard. But how did we get here? How did two AAA live services with competent developers launch and yet fail so quickly? For 2XKO, it's kind of complicated. The game itself wasn't bad, it was actually pretty good, but there were a couple of problems. For one, people have pointed to the name itself being a problem. This is subjective, but 2XKO doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well, or is as catchy of a title. It's not that marketable is what I'm trying to say. Compared to popular fighting game names like Street Fighter, Guilty Gear, Mortal Kombat, and Tekken, and I think you can see that 2XKO may not be as good of a name. And speaking of marketing, this game was just not marketed very well. Some of you might not even have heard of 2XKO. Personally, I've only gotten a few YouTube ads about it in the last week or so. And for the marketing that Riot did do, they were really trying to attract the fighting game community, but therein lies another problem. Fighting games in general are a pretty niche genre, so that community isn't as big as, say, MOBAs or hero shooters. And fighting games are niche in the first place because they're kind of hard to get into. They're actually a lot more complicated than you might think, and those games can get pretty hectic. And on top of all of that, 2XKO is also a tag fighter, which makes the game even more chaotic for anyone that isn't initiated, I guess you can say, into fighting games. But for 2XKO's freemium model to work, they need a big player base to be profitable, and the majority of a healthy player base are casual players. But these casual players, or even interested players that came from Riot's other games, like League or Valorant, found that 2XKO isn't really the game for them. And if they aren't playing the game, then they obviously aren't buying things like skins or anything else. And for the players that like fighting games and are a part of the fighting game community, they really don't like this kind of monetization system. In pretty much any other fighting game, the only reason you'd ever buy anything within the game is to buy a character pack or a character pass. And for a lot of these games, you can buy several characters for around the same price of a cosmetic in 2XKO, so the value just wasn't there for these kinds of players. Unfortunately for 2XKO, it kind of drove away the players it needed to survive. It's a bit too complex for most casual players to pick up, and the ones that like fighting games do not like the monetization system compared to other popular titles. Riot unfortunately bit off a bit more than they can chew and underestimated how difficult breaking into the fighting game genre could be. Again, it's a pretty niche genre. For Highguard, however, the story is long but not so complicated. It was set up for failure at the very beginning when it was the final announcement of the 2025 Game Awards, which is usually the spot reserved for the biggest and most hyped game reveals. But while the reveal saying that it was developed by Titanfall veterans did initially get people excited, they were dismayed to find out that Highguard was another hero shooter, a genre already dominated by popular titles such as Marvel Rivals, Overwatch 2, Apex Legends, and Valorant. Worse still was that Highguard itself looked quite generic and safe. It didn't have any kind of unique identity or art style to it, and people in general were quite tired of new hero shooters. There's already a lot of games in the genre. The Game Award review completely tanked Highguard's image. People were saying that this game was Concord 2, that it was going to fail, and people weren't happy that it was the final announcement of the night, when there were some truly standout reveals like Divinity and Fate of the Old Republic. The backlash did not go unnoticed by Wildlight, and they ended up not doing any more marketing for the game until the day of its launch, which is quite unusual for a game's release. The intent of having a surprise launch was so they can have the game speak for itself, and Wildlight was confident that Highguard could be successful. Unfortunately for Wildlight, people's assumptions about Highguard turned out to be correct. Not only were people right in feeling that Highguard's art direction and identity were uninspired, the game was also poorly optimized, and it was 3v3 when the map is actually pretty big, so it felt quite empty. On top of that, Highguard was a mix of a lot of game genres that people felt didn't really go together. Highguard had raiding and base building, hero characters, scavenging, breaching and clearing, capturing the flag, and players just felt that all of these mechanics weren't harmonious. They weren't really coming together as well as they could be. Highguard launched to overwhelmingly negative reviews at first, but it did eventually go up to mixed, which still isn't that great, but at least it's not the worst game ever. Highguard's bad press up to launch did bolster its player count at launch because people were just curious if it was as bad as people thought. 97,000 players? That's not bad, but it fell off pretty quickly because again, the game just doesn't stand out enough and it doesn't rise up to the expectations people have for a free live service these days. Now, did Highguard's bad press since its Game Award reveal cement its failure? I personally don't think so, but an ex-developer from Highguard believes otherwise. He reflected on Highguard's development, but there were a couple of things he says that I think are red flags. On Highguard's development, he states, "Everyone I knew who had any connection to the team or project had the same sentiments. This is lightning in a bottle. I trust this team wholeheartedly. If there's one project nobody in the industry is worried will fail, it's yours. This has mainstream hit written all over it. There's no way this will flop. I could play this game all day. The internal pre-review feedback, even from unbiased sources, was quite positive, and where it was negative, it was constructive and often actionable. People who played the game, including us, had a blast. And since we were an independent self-published studio built with royalties in mind, many of us were hoping this would finally be the thing that broke the millennial financial curse." I'm sorry to say it, but Highguard sounds like it was developed in a bubble. It wasn't properly vetted or tested. This sounds like toxic positivity, and this kind of feedback is not helpful, especially when Highguard is going into the extremely competitive live service market that even PlayStation is struggling to make their games in. Highguard didn't get an alpha or open beta or anything like that to get genuine and real player feedback that could improve the game meaningfully. This statement implies that the development team was completely blindsided by criticism by the wider gaming community, which would not be possible if the game was receiving the right feedback. I'm sorry, but the development of the game was too disconnected from what players actually wanted and were interested in. This is what people think of when they say that something is tested by focus groups. Highguard's development was an echo chamber where they were reaffirming and self-validating their own decisions, and they never learned what they were doing wrong and what they could do better. And if it wasn't that, then whoever was relaying feedback to the development team were cherry-picking reactions and feedback that were positive and ignoring the negative. He continues, "In discussions online about Highguard, Concord, 2XKO and such, it is often pointed out by gamers that devs like to blame gamers for their failures, and that's silly. As if gamers have no power, but they do, a lot of it. I'm not saying that our failure is purely the fault of gamer culture and that the game would have thrived without the negative discourse, but it absolutely played a role. All products are at the whims of the consumers, and the consumers put absurd amounts of effort into slandering Highguard, and it worked." This sentiment is becoming increasingly common in creative works in the industry, and I just don't think it's true. People are really overestimating how much sway the loudest voices have. Now, did review bombing happen? Yes, it did. The game launched to overwhelmingly negative reviews, which I don't think it deserved. But once more reviews came out, the game shot up to mixed, which does mean Highguard actually got its share of positive reviews as well. And this dismisses the majority of negative reviews, which have valid criticisms and complaints about Highguard. The vast majority of critics of Highguard aren't memeing or doing it out of malice. The game is genuinely not that great. It's not terrible, but it's not that good either, which the mixed rating represents perfectly. Overall, it does suck to see another 2 live services fail, and who gets the shorter end of the stick? It's employees, real people who are trying to make a living doing what they love in an industry that is extraordinarily hard to break into and survive in. You have to be so skilled, so talented, and work so hard, and yet you'll always be the one bearing the brunt of the consequences brought by bad leadership, bad management, and yet the company companies that wanted this in the first place are unharmed and just wash their hands of it and move on to the next venture. I'm tired of seeing live services releasing and collapsing. As fun as it is to imagine that these companies are bleeding millions from these failures, it's real working developers paying the price. And if this keeps happening, then the gaming industry just bleeds talent. Who would want to work in an industry that keeps grinding them up and spitting them back out? And that loss of talents means worse games. People's livelihoods are being uprooted, and we get a worse product. Go figure. But I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments down below. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.